Everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Debra Stone, and I'm an assistant professor of accounting at Eastern New Mexico University, and I teach, one of the things I teach is taxes, and I'm a CPA. So today I'm going to give you, I'm going to share my screen, a little bit of information about the history of taxes and try to provide you some interesting background in taxes and talk a little bit about the United States and what the history is there. So I hope you enjoy this presentation, if you can, about taxes, which no one seemed to like. But anyways, let's find out more about taxes, how they came to be. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to go through and we're going to discuss that. So let's start. And first of all, the title of this presentation is Taxes in History, the Good, the Bad, and the Almost Fair. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this presentation. First of all, what about the purpose of taxation? Taxes are levied in almost every country of the world, primarily to raise revenue for government expenditures. Although they serve other purposes, taxes can serve to allocate resources, redistribute income, and provide security for a country or a people. And countries around the world all use different methods of gathering taxes. Mostly, they're similar to what we're going to talk about today, but it basically depends on the country and their policies. But they all have different policies of taxation, and the United States even has tax treaties with the various countries around. And those are signed by the president, but made by the State Department. And those would help their treaties, and it talks between countries how we're going to go about working out issues of taxation. So let's get started. And there's classes of taxes, by the way. You can think of them in two ways. There's direct taxes, and these would be income taxes based on the ability to pay. Or it could be inheritance on the beneficiary if you inherited something, or estate taxes, which are on the estate when a person dies. There could be a tax on that. In the United States, we have a federal estate tax, and we also have some states that have that as well. Real estate, we think of property taxes, okay, that we pay on our homes, corporate and other property taxes. And what other property means is other property than real estate, okay, because you could get taxed on your equipment if you were a business, or other things that you owned besides real estate. There's also indirect taxes, which are sales taxes, basically, or it could be value added or import duties. Sales taxes are what we think of normally when we go to the store and buy something and have to pay a sales tax. We don't have a national sales tax. The individual states have sales taxes. Not all states have sales taxes. Some do, some don't. Not all states have income taxes. Some do, some don't. Value-added tax, common in Europe, is a tax that's imposed at different levels of production during manufacturing, for example, of a product, or it could be import duties. So those are, in general, the classes of taxes. What about the history of taxation? Well, even though we don't like taxes very much, it's a fact that we're often told that the only thing certain in life is death or taxes, and in ancient times, taxation was a factor. Not as sophisticated as today, but it was a factor. In ancient Egypt, in the earlier days of ancient Egypt, they were a society without cash, and they relied on what was called the cattle count to collect taxes. Egypt was divided into areas called districts. And the fields were then surveyed for value and production that came out of the fields to assess taxes. Things that could be assessed could be beer, oil, pottery, livestock, any kind of commodity. Some of the first accountants were employed to help do this and get the taxes for the pharaohs, and taxes from these counts provided the resources, by the way, to build the pyramid. So think of that as a public project, and they needed taxes to build that. In Rome, earlier on, they used what's called head taxes, which are also called poll taxes, and those are on each person would pay a tax. And those could be extended as well to property taxes that the people own, the property that they own. Julius Caesar instituted a 1% sales tax, and later land taxes also included taxes on production on the land itself. So different ways, even in Rome, yes, think about it, Rome was a huge empire with a big army to support and a wide countries that they, basically overtook and became part of the Roman Empire, and they collected taxes. The tax collector was called a publican, and they bid at the Roman Senate for the right to collect taxes for certain areas. Remember that in the Bible, Matthew was a tax collector. If the revenue exceeded the bid, the tax collector would keep the rest. So tax collectors were not popular. So the more they could collect, the more they could keep for themselves. They bid on an amount in the Senate, and then they were the tax collector for that area. And their empire was broad, and one of the things that they had to do was raise taxes to support the empire. And that is Rome, okay? During the Middle Ages, there was a reliance on transit duties, and those are when goods passed through countries. Okay, they would have what's called a transit duty or other market or to the market fees. In cities, there were taxes on food and drink, and those were paid by consumers and tradesmen alike. Later, some European countries instituted head taxes, which had been done earlier, as we talked about, and property taxes, and also property and net worth taxes for the wealthy. Amounts of taxes on property increased over time. Now, the same thing, they needed to raise money for the kings and queens or the monarchs to run the country for public good for them, etc. Some of the things, if you can remember that if taxes aren't fair, guess what happens? You could be overthrown. You could have a revolution. Okay, but at any rate, that's the Middle Ages, okay? And modern times, well, one of the things that one of the famous people at the beginning of the modern times was Adam Smith. You can think of him as an economist. One of the things he said is that all people should contribute to the support of their government in proportion to their income. In other words, everybody needs to pitch in, okay, based on their income or etc. And taxes should be certain and not arbitrary. Very important, because if they're not certain and people can't plan for them, and they're arbitrary and people don't feel that they're fair, then people are more likely not to pay them and or to rebel against them. Taxes should be collected in a manner that's convenient. So you want to make it convenient for the taxpayer to pay the taxes, and you want to make sure that the taxes aren't too high, that they allow taxpayers to keep as much as possible as their money. Those are the major things that, in order to have a good tax policy, that he believed. Now, because taxes were unpopular, and by the way, not always done fairly, there were tax protests. One of the tax protests that's very famous is Lady Godiva. Lady Godiva was a lady circa 1000 AD in Coventry, England, and she was married to an earl and who had taxed the people, and she was in favor of her husband lowering the taxes, and he said, well, if you ride, I will lower the taxes when you ride through the streets naked. Guess what? The rest is history. Lady Godiva is known in history for riding naked through the streets. Okay, that was a tax protest. So taxes have always had issues and been unpopular, as we know in our country. The Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773, this was the first major act of colonists that dumped tea into the Boston harbor. And they were protesting taxation without representation. Okay? So you can see the pattern. If you think about what we talked about with Adam Smith, if the taxes are not fair, there could be issues. So one of the things you want to make sure when doing tax policies is making them fair. Another tax protest in the United States, the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania, was a tax protest in the U.S. beginning in 1791 and ending in 1794 during the presidency of George Washington. And the protesters were protesting a whiskey tax instituted by the federal government. They were very unhappy at that time. They had just fought a war about unfair taxes, and they felt that this whiskey tax was unfair, and they were coming and taking their money. So there was a tax protest at that time. Well, some of the things that we need to institute to make it basically fair, equitable, and making sure that we don't cause protests and that people will agree enough to pay the taxes that they feel they're getting their value out of the taxes, is that people in the same position will pay at the same level of tax. So people in the same economic position would pay a similar tax, basically. It's equity horizontally across groups. And the taxes would be distributed in proportion to the taxpayer's ability to pay. Okay, so they need to have, taxpayers need to be able to pay their taxes. It can't be so onerous that there's no way they can pay it. So again, a principle there is fairness. The administration, in our case, the administration would be the IRS here, to be accountable so that they would be transparent and accountable to how they're doing the collection of taxes. And the taxes collected should correspond to public wishes for benefits. Now, the way it works here is that in our Congress, the Congress has the task of passing tax laws, and it goes through the whole Congress, okay, the Senate and the House, and eventually goes to the president to sign. After that time, okay, that it goes to the president, what happens is the president, once it's signed, the president is the executive branch, and the executive branch has authority over the Treasury Department, and the Internal Revenue Service is under the Treasury Department, and they are charged with putting the tax laws into practice. Okay, so as you well know, sometimes laws are unclear, so the Internal Revenue Service makes regulations, etc., and they put the taxes into practice so that they can be collected. But it is part of the Treasury Department. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but sometimes you could make your check to the IRS, but it would say Department of Treasury. Make your check to Department of Treasury for your payment. And that's where this idea of the taxes collected should correspond to public wishes. That's why you vote for people to go to the Senate and Congress, vote for your parties or whatever it is that you believe in for that aspect. We come together and we make these tax laws, and that is how it gets put into practice. Economics, Well, one of the key factors here is taxes should not interfere with the economic allocation of resources. Do not make taxes that are interfering with the economy in general. Okay, that does not mean that social goals cannot take preference. And that means, for example, you could put a tax on pollution in order to discourage pollution. And that may be necessary. That isn't, but you don't want to make the taxes interfere with the regular market, because that would be defeating the purpose of our trying to make money and get better in our economy. Still have to raise money for taxes, but we don't want to make it so that we hurt the economy in doing so. Okay, so taxation, a little bit about taxation in the United States. The Constitution was drafted and ratified in 1788, providing that Congress was entitled to collect taxes. Excise taxes were common, and after the rebellion that we talked about earlier with the whiskey, property taxes were used, but again, later they were abolished in favor of excise taxes once again. So one of the things we don't think about, but is absolutely true, and I see that I should have capitalized this C in Civil War, but I'm not going to redo the whole thing for that. But anyways, taxes often financed wars, the War of 1812 and the Civil War, very common. How else would we have, at that point, we didn't have income taxes. We had to finance these wars, and we raised money with taxes. Also, the young nation often sold public land or imposed duties to collect money. So we did have public land, and we could sell it to get money. But at that time, way back then, we did not have an income tax until the Civil War period. Had an income tax, but it was abolished after the Civil War. So, okay, and then unfortunately, life without income taxes became a fond memory with the passage of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913. The taxes were increased in 1916 to finance World War I. So you can see these wars, whenever we have them, obviously we need a lot of extra money, right? And a lot of times we don't plan the war. So we don't know that. So sometimes we have to institute this during the war periods. During World War II, taxes increased again to finance the war. The Internal Revenue Code was originally compiled in 1939 and overhauled in 1954 and again in 1986. And just as we discussed, the Congress makes tax law, and the laws are signed into final law by the president. Well, taxes are coming up again right now, as we all know. Tax day is April 15th. Last year, it got extended till July 15th because of the coronavirus. I think that's the one time I mean, obviously the coronavirus is a whole different ball of wax, but people were not able to file their tax returns on time, and Congress, or not Congress, but when they changed the filing deadline to July 15th, they also helped that people didn't have to pay the taxes right away that they owed, if they owed any, which would help them during the pandemic time. So there were a lot of reasons for that. The IRS had to operate at a distance remotely. So it was a really difficult time for all, as we well know. So, but this year we're shooting for April 15th for our tax returns as usual. And you can see now when you do your tax return on April 15th, what goes behind our tax system. Our tax system, even though, it ends up we fill out a form and, we get all stressed out and we have to gather all our money we have to pay and etc. It's not a happy time unless we're getting a refund. But after this presentation, you should be able to get a feeling for taxes during history and how taxes started and why we have taxes and how we have to, or what the most important things about tax policy, making it fair, etc. Also know that at different times there have been tax protests and people not happy with the way taxes were collected. So important as to how we set up the system and make it efficient and fair for as many people or for everyone, okay, as we possibly can, okay? And that makes us successful as a country. You should also know that taxation is part of economic policy, okay? I mean, if you think about it, we talked about earlier that one of the goals was could be redistribution of wealth. Well, that's really something that's part of the U.S. system because everybody has a different tax rate. If you make a lower amount of money or a less amount of money, you're going to pay a lower rate than somebody who makes more money, and they're going to pay a higher rate, which is redistribution of the wealth. Okay, now you should also know that sales taxes are interesting because they don't really, that's not part of the sales tax. The sales tax, everybody pays. So the proportionate amount of the sales tax that you pay on basics like food, that everybody buys. Well, we don't have sales taxes on food here, but things that everybody buys that aren't food, okay, items that we all buy. The more money you make, you may have a smaller proportion of those items out of your general income than the proportion of somebody who makes less money. So sales taxes aren't really the best way to do taxes because of that. Although you can remember that during economic hardship times, I don't know if we all remember this, I'm sure we do, back in the recent financial crisis, it was, anybody who based their tax system on property taxes, okay, had difficulty because people weren't paying them because they had no money and because, etc. And it was difficult to sell the houses, so the tax collectors could not sell the houses to get the money. So a lot of times they had property taxes owed to them that they weren't getting because people weren't paying their mortgage payments. So you can see at times during like that, sales taxes are better because they collect it right at the point of sale. So there's all different aspects that we have to think about in taxes. And that's kind of what I'm trying to give you a big picture here. Taxation in the United States, we think of it as the Internal Revenue Service, which it is. But again, you can see that the Congress makes the laws and that we vote for our representatives to help get what we see personally as the best way, or as we see personally, the things that the government should be spending money on. So, when you're paying your taxes on April 15th, think of the whole history of being a citizen of whatever country you are living in at that time, whether it was ancient Rome or ancient Egypt, and many other countries that I didn't include here. People over time have paid taxes as part of living in a community. So that I think we all have in common and that we can talk about and understand. That's why I wanted to do a little bit about the history of taxation so we can see that we're not the first people who ever did this and that the systems are very similar over time, the ways to do it. I guess, and in the early United States, we didn't have a big federal government, okay? So it was mostly the states that did a lot of this. So we didn't have the need for this big system. Now we have a big federal government, so we have to have a different system. So I think it's good to have knowledge of this so you can become a more informed citizen and understand basically how it all became to be. And I hope you enjoyed this today, this presentation. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. I know you may not enjoy taxes, which may be a given, okay? No, I don't know how many people do, but at least you understand a little bit more about it. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I want to wish you a very happy day. Thank you. Thank you very much, and have a great day.